Hi, Joel. You're on mute. You'll have to click the unmute button down there.
Sorry.
That's okay.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. I just sent you a share file link with the presentation in both PowerPoint and PDF.
All right.
It was 24 megs PowerPoint, and I don't know what it was when it's PDF, but I figured that's probably too large. So
They get it kind of astronomical out there, don't they?
they do. They do. Let's see what the PDF was. PDF was 4.76 megs. So I could send you that if you can. You should be able to download from the share file site, but
Yeah, I can download those. I was just checking in there to.
okay. I can run it from here. I'm at my office. I have really good fiber internet, and
Okay.
that will allow me not to have to bother you with, hey, Autumn, change the slide. Hey, Autumn, change the slide.
Next. All right.
But you'll have it anyway. Sorry I didn't get it to you sooner. I was out in the field for the last couple of days, and things are kind of wild and woolly, I tell you what.
They are.
So this doesn't really officially start till noon, is that right?
Yes, it doesn't actually start till noon. I just like to get it started ahead of time just so everybody can.
Oh, understood completely. I'm going to step away unless for about 5 minutes, but I'll be back.
Okay, sounds great.
Well, let's do this. While I'm here, let's see if I can share my screen. Do you want to see if that works? This one.
Yep, I can see your screen.
All right, perfect. All right, I'll be back in about 5 minutes on them. Thanks.
All right, I'll see you then.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Grizzly.
How you doing?
Fine, you?
Don't act like you're not impressed, Bill.
I'm very impressed. You always have been.
Hi, Adam. It's Paul. I'm on.
Hi, Paul.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Just trying to keep on keeping on today.
Yeah, try and stay dry. It's pretty nasty out there.
Yeah.
So we got sent pictures of the house up in Nevada City, and we have probably a good 6 or 7 inches of snow.
Wow.
Hi, David.
Hi, Autumn. I'm gonna go get a quick bite to eat. I'll be back.
All right, we'll see you then.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. This is Autumn, and I'm kind of running the meeting in the background. So if you are not speaking, if you wouldn't mind leaving yourself on mute, and that way the sound's not picked up by everybody else. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all.
Good afternoon. We're starting to get a pretty good turnout, so we'll be getting going in a minute or two. One reminder before we begin, if people could mute their mic unless they're presenting, because everyone is able to unmute, and that could get noisy. So thank you.
Paul,
Yes.
this is Ann Dawson. I am iPad 10. Do you know how to identify me instead of as iPad 10? When I try it, it doesn't stick.
I'll turn that over to Autumn, who's the expert
Autumn.
in all these things.
Okay,
Nice to hear from you, Ann.
you too.
I won't call you iPad 10. There you are. All right. Good afternoon. It's noontime. I'm Paul Goslin. I'm Director of Butte County's Department of Water and Resource Conservation. I want to welcome you all that you've joined us here for the first Brown Bag Seminar, Perspectives on Butte County Land Use Changes. We decided to put the seminar series together to provide the public with an opportunity to have more in-depth presentations on informational topics that have been coming up at various meetings, particularly around focused on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. For those of you who've been involved in board meetings, advisory committee meetings, and others, you know they're full of a lot of topics to get the plans done by January, but there's increasing interest in a lot of technical and informational issues related to SGMA and related to water resource topics. So to afford the public a better opportunity to hear factual information and presentations, and then have an opportunity to have questions and answers, we decided to do this Brown Bag Seminar. So we'll be scheduling other ones in the future and be talking to our boards, advisory committees, and others on key topics, but one may be the AEM project or other types of projects. So today, I'm going to kick this right off. We'll hear from 3 speakers who have conducted analysis of land use changes in Butte County and in other areas. And we'll have each speaker talk for about 20 minutes, present their analysis and their program. And at the end of the presentations, all 3 presentations, we're going to then open it up to a question and answer period, just to afford everyone the ability of the speakers to get through their presentations in the time we have. We're going to ask people if they could hold all questions till the end, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. We are recording this meeting, this seminar, and we will be posting it on the department's webpage under education. So the meeting materials and the meeting seminar itself will be posted. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, will be Amy Raymond. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So what I had asked Paul to talk about was a change in the harvested acreage, crop selection, and applied water usage in Butte County from 1980 to 2019. And that's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at my email. Just a little bit about who I am. I'm a Butte County Water Commissioner representing District 3. For Tammy, I served as the Vice Chair at Rock Creek. I've got a Master's in Systems Engineering from SMU and a BA in Chemistry at UC San Diego. And I currently work full-time as a engineering fellow, which is equivalent to a director, but it's a technical ladder for Johnson & Johnson. For the past 25 years. I'm working right now in the innovation portfolio management for the entire Johnson & Johnson supply chain, and previously was doing new product development on blood glucose, drug-eluting stents, was a quality engineer, worked in external manufacturing. So I have a breadth. I work in supply chain. I guess have a come at things as kind of what the big systems look like. I also have numerous startups under my belt, currently working on one with my son. And I grew up in Palo Alto, moved to Chico, I guess 5 years ago, married 4 kids, and 3 of them all went through Chico State. So I feel like I've been in town for a very, very long time. The motivation for this analysis was a lot of, back at the end of last year, we just observed a lot of new orchards when we drove down to the LA area. I fly free flight model airplanes as a hobby with my family. And so we spend a lot of time down in the Bakersfield, Lost Hills area and camp out there and everything. And there's some ginormous water pipelines that have been built out there. I'm talking like 3 or 4 feet diameter, huge things, and lots of arid grasslands that have been planted. I've also watched the wonderful nut factory growing up all over the place over there. So I was worried about what the change in water demand was by the San Joaquin Valley, given that we live at the top of the watershed, and provide a lot of water. I also wanted to know what the value of water is. I hear a lot about the water market starting. And so how would you value water? What is it worth? And then I also wanted to kind of know what was changing around us in our environment, what was happening in Glenn County, and what was happening in Tehama County, and how that might be affecting things that were going on. So those were the things I was thinking about when I put this together. So I kind of hope to ask, what's the trend? This is a 39, almost 40-year period because I'm using the crop reports on it. So those go back to 1980 to 2019. And I was looking for, trends in the harvested acreage, the value, what crops were happening where, how that acreage has changed. And then with the recent release of the Land IQ report, I was very intrigued with their applied water usage calculation, and was able to extend that with their calculation. So my method was I'm using for analysis is Microsoft Power BI. This is a free data analysis tool. So I've left the link. You can download it and run it yourself, and I'd be more than happy to share this data model with you. I got my data from the USDA crop report. So this is the link. I've also linked the data to the commodity codes and my source there, the counties and the county codes. And then finally the Land IQ, which I used, I pulled their applied water calculation out of. So with all that jammed all together, basically I downloaded all of the data files from 1980 to 2019, mashed them together, did a little bit of cleaning of the data. And so kind of from a top level view, if we look at the San Joaquin Valley for all crops, so these are my filters up here, and then I'm plotting the number of harvested acres per year over time. So vertical axis, and then time down here is 1980 to 20. When I first did this analysis, I kind of had noticed in Butte County that there was a variety of kind of periods where there was changes in some of the data. So I had coded it, and I just left that analysis. There's really not, these are arbitrary periods of where I thought things were increasing and decreasing. But overall, you can see net in San Joaquin Valley for all crops that they have gone down from 10.6 million acres down to 10.1 million acres. And you can see the distribution of what those crops were. And basically they lost 1 million acres of pasture rangeland, which is not irrigated. So you kind of see this distribution. If we look at what their cropland has done, if I exclude pasture range, since that's not irrigated, and we're all here interested in water consumption, that has been slightly increasing. And what's notable is kind of, we're getting a lot more just big crops versus a sort of kaleidoscope of crops going on. And the top hit list, almonds have moved up to the top there. And then for the fruit and nut crops specifically, which are key to what's going on in Butte County, I think worthy of a comparison, is that they've added 1 million acres of fruit and nut crops in lined up my timeframes with the Land IQ report, which you'll hear about later, but just so that we're kind of in the same, ballparks of stuff. They added 750,000 acres of almonds and 300,000 acres of pistachios. They took out grapes and they added some walnuts up there. And so now almonds are 42% of all the crops, nut crops that are grown down in the San Joaquin Valley. So this reaffirmed my suspicion was they were planting a lot of trees, and we're talking about 1999 when we already knew they were having trouble, securing water. So what's happening in the Sacramento Valley? So the Sacramento Valley has, again, they've gone from 350,000 acres to 600,000 acres here just in fruit and nut crops. So again, they are also growing, and now, virtually 75% of all of the fruit and nut crops are in only two crops, being almonds and walnuts. And it used to be substantially with dried plums, having almost 22%. So we've lost plums. So this is Sacramento Valley. And then this is what's happening in Butte County. So between, this is total acres. So this is for all commodities of everything that we grow. We have lost about 70,000 acres, but we gained 32,000 acres of fruit and nut crops, and we lost almost 100,000 acres of field and seed crops in that. So this overall downward trend. But again, we're 3/4 of our county are field and seed, field and seed versus the fruit and nut. And then what happened in our field and seed crops? So we lost this 100,000 acres, and that loss came from 74,000 acres of pasture range, which is not irrigated. So this green area out here, and we lost 6,000 acres of irrigated pastures. Rice is in here, and rice has been constant. It's down by 300 acres, but it fluctuates a little bit. So I would virtually call rice as unchanged in that. And then, so for Butte County in fruit and nut crops, then we gained that 32,000 that you saw in the overall, and that came to us by a gain of 38,000 acres in walnuts, 2,000 acres in almonds, and we lost 7,000 acres in dried plums, which is consistent with what we've seen everywhere else. But, virtually 90% of what we grow is in two crops. So we're becoming more of a monocrop tree and nut crop. We have lost over here really the peaches, olives, and kiwi, and others are now a very small slice of other fruit and nut crops that are going on. So then I was interested, well, what's Glenn County up to? So Glenn County, actually, they've been on a really big growth spree. So they have more than doubled the amount of acres that they have in fruit and nut crops from, basically 50,000 to now well over 100,000. And they have also repeated the same pattern with almonds and walnuts. Tehama County, same sort of thing. They're also up about 40% in total acreage. They added 14,000 acres of walnuts, 7,000 acres of almonds, and they too are almost, are 75%. They have been building their olives though. They added 2,000 acres of olives on that. So net out of all of that, all areas lost total overall harvested acres, but all areas gained acreage of fruit and nut crops at the loss of pasture range and field crops on that. So within the fruit and nut crops, San Joaquin Valley gained 1 million acres. They had a 50% growth over this time period. Sacramento Valley gained 250,000 with a 75% growth. Butte County added 32,000, Glenn added 64,000, Tehama added 18,000. All in all, we're growing an awful lot of fruit and nut out here. I was interested in Glenn and Tehama because we know from the watershed that the water flows in from Tehama on our North County border, and then the water models are looking like water flows to Glenn County away from us. So this is suggesting that we might be a little worried about, we're going to have less water flowing into our into our county area of the subbasin, and Glenn County is having more demand and might be pulling harder to pull water away from our subbasin. So that was really what I wanted to take a look at, and I guess it confirmed my suspicions on that. The next area I kind of went into was what is it worth? Because we're talking about a water market, and so what is the value of the crops that are there? So again, similar time frame. You're looking at the harvested acres, and this plot is what the total value of those crops were in that harvest year. And this grid up here shows you what the median value is per acre. So in the San Joaquin Valley, for all fruit and nut trees, in the current period, they're getting about $7,000 per acre, per harvested acre, for fruit and nut crops. And again, you can this could get broken down, but I think the gist is I was interested in it was $7,000. In Butte County, same category, we're getting about $3,500, half the amount of money per acre is what we're returning on. So an acre that's invested in fruit and nut trees on average in Butte County gets $3,500. So half the value of what an acre in the San Joaquin Valley is. For field and seed crops, they're getting about $500 an acre, and that actually, it's been going down on that aspect. So in net, for fruit and nut crop, San Joaquin's getting $7,000 an acre, Butte County gets $3,500 an acre, and for field and seed, San Joaquin Valley is getting $650 an acre, and Butte County, the latest year, is getting $430. So in a water market economy, a San Joaquin Valley grower, I think, can easily outbid a Butte County grower. If we value water very quickly, a grower who's only making $400 an acre can't compete even within the county, much less, cross counties. So just kind of a watch out of what it's worth for somebody to maybe come in and buy or market or manage water here. The next area I was interested in was the amount of applied water. So again, I calculated, so given the crop that you have and the water demand for the applied water that is required of that crop, and then you just lay that over time, this top graph, so this is for Butte County fruit and nut crops. And again, I don't want to go, I'll let Joel talk about what the calculation is, but the applied water acre feet per year in totality is going up over years. This is simply the harvested acres. And the other interesting calculation was if you take, I was interested in what's the average water you apply on any given acre. So if you took a random acre that was being having applied water, the median, weighted median, because the mixture is changing. So back in the 80s, it was on the order for fruit and nuts, it was on the order of 41 acre inches per year. And the mixture of crops has now taken that up to 46 acre inches per year of applied water. So applied water is the water it needs, less the water that rains, plus the additional inefficiency of the irrigation system that's being used, in short. And then if you look at it then in totality of all of the crops on the demand for all crops in Butte County, on average, we are slowly increasing the amount of average water that we have to put on an acre that we are harvesting on. So the net of total water is flat to slightly increasing because our harvested acres are kind of it's demanding more water. So I had just kind of quickly for, you've seen all of these well hydrograph, graph sort of thing was for a typical well. And this one goes back to 1959 to 2016. If you kind of overlay the timeline, I was curious as, we're all aware we had this really flat zone. And then we started dying, it started to decay and the ground and the wells started feeling the effect. So I kind of, something to be proved or thought about was this time frame was, do we have maybe a demand capacity of maybe 35, 36 acre inches of water, and that as we are growing, our demand on it is that maybe that is attributing to what the wells are feeling, is that they're feeling this need for the crops that are on top that are demanding more water. Again, this is, I put this in there more as a point, maybe this applied water demand weighting could become a control measure for us. So the impact to applied water using the land IQ assumptions is that the shift in crop type is increasing the amount of applied water required for any harvested acre. And this weighted average has slowly been increasing from 35 acre inches per year to 45 acre inches per year. So this might become a good measure. Summarize this all up. Keene Valley needs to be taken into consideration. They have added a whole lot of acreage in their crops. They're getting twice the amount of money per acre for those same crops, and they're experiencing the same thing. They're shifting their crop selection to something that is now requiring 50% more applied water. So they were in a shortfall to begin with. They're moving into a direction that creates even more demand on that. For Butte County and our surrounding areas, we've added a good 100,000 acres in the fruit and nut crops, which is not a problem. I mean, it totally makes sense. It's like, who wants to go make $500 an acre when you could have, change your crop and be grossing $3,500 an acre. Market tells us that. And so we should be aware that the market is driving these crop selections there. But with that crop selection comes an increased demand of water that needs to go on that particular selection of crops. And that we need to have a conversation at some point. We may not be able to sustain all of the crops at this, at this level. It also brings up that the irrigation, investing in irrigation efficiencies has a tremendous impact on shifting of these curves. And we should probably incentivize growers tremendously to take on technology to become more efficient, which is kind of my sweet spot, is bringing in new technologies. But let's go, let's go at it. But just be aware of what the environment is that we're facing. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Paul.
All right. Thank you, Amy. That was excellent. A lot of good information. So I'll ask people if they could hold their questions till after the speakers, but write down your questions and thoughts from Amy. And then next up, we'll have Joel Kimmelshoe from Land IQ, who will give an overview of a report, 20-year land and water use changes in Butte County and the Vina Subbasin from 1999 to 2019. So Joel, I think you can upload your presentation. Thank you all.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. I think it needs to be put on full presentation.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will. I'm assuming you can hear me too then.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks, Christina, for allowing me to present today. I appreciate it. I'll just jump right into it. So some of you here, many of you probably are asking who is Land IQ, and I'll just give you a short introduction to Land IQ. I used to work for a large engineering consulting scientific firm for a number of years called CH2, now Jacobs Engineering. In 2007, we decided to start our own business, and we're about 35 land-based scientists, spatial scientists, and data scientists that focus on agricultural land use as well as consumptive use, or the amount of water that crops use. And we work in these areas that I list here. The purpose in developing the company that we did was to link land-based knowledge with spatial knowledge, and that marriage is important when you're looking across a large landscape to determine differences in land use change and correspondingly, in this case, water use change. This is a select list of clients that we work for when we talk about crop mapping or crop water use. We're the contractor for the California Department of Water Resources that maps every single agricultural field from Mexico to Oregon, Nevada, the Pacific Ocean. And we do work for a number of commodity groups for a number of years, the Almond Board, Walnut Board, Pistachio Research Board, et cetera. All for the purposes of their better understanding the acreages that they're dealing with and the amount of growth or reduction, depending on what crop type you're talking about, in land use. Once you have that acreage mapping down, a lot of these commodity organizations and groundwater sustainability agencies and Central Valley irrigation water districts that we work for as well use that information for what I call actionable intelligence, in which they use the spatial mapping of crop type for answering a number of different questions. In this case, we're looking at how has land use changed and how has therefore crop water use changed as well over the past 20 years. We were contacted by the agricultural groundwater users of Butte County to kind of have a discussion with regards to some views in the county with regards to crop acreage, how that has changed, and some differing views on crop water use. So we developed a scope of work and plan to take a look at the last couple decades of land use change and corresponding water use change. We specifically looked at agriculture because that's our area of expertise, but we also, because we map things spatially everywhere, we correspondingly were able to look at a change in urban land use and a change in environmental land use. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. So one or two slides on sustainable groundwater management, what's driving all of this. And it's kind of a new era in California agriculture and in California water resources as a whole. For those of you who don't know, which is probably very few on this call, but the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed by the state legislature in 2014. And it's the first time in the history of California that the state has regulated the management and use of groundwater. Very important legislation with regards to sustainability of water resources. And the key point here is that it requires local governments and water agencies in high, medium priority basins to halt overdraft. Figure out ways to become sustainable with regards to the balance of groundwater levels in their various subbasins or basins. Part of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was require DWR by law to provide land use mapping throughout the state. And so that's why we're hired as a contractor to do that. And we've been doing that since 2014. And I think this quote by Governor Jerry Brown on the right-hand side is pretty important. Groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally. I'm a firm believer that local knowledge is the best knowledge for the folks that use that water, and they understand their systems quite well. So we'll jump right into land use mapping because that's foundational to the work that we did. So again, we're the contractor that maps statewide land use for DWR. Currently in our 2020 mapping, the map on the right is from back in 2014, the first year, but in our 2020 mapping, we have delineated and mapped approximately 406,000 individually classified polygons, and those represent about 9.55 million acres of agriculture and about 4.87 million acres of urban, and about 500,000 acres, or about 500,000 acres of managed wetlands or environmental uses, if you will. I thought the most interesting thing about this, these stats, once we got done mapping everything in the state, which was a big undertaking, that the urban footprint in the state of California is about half again as much as the agricultural footprint. What if I went into this and thought about what it would be, I probably would have guessed maybe like 20 or 30%. But it's a fairly large footprint and, concentrated on the coastal areas and some areas of the Central Valley. Our mapping, we delineate the irrigated portion of every field, which isn't parcel boundaries or it's just the irrigated footprint. So it's a true representation of the irrigated portion of every field. Our minimum field size is 2 acres. And for some of the commodity organizations that we work for, like the California Avocado Commission, they have very small fields, and we're contracted to provide even smaller field sizes. The overall accuracy of our mapping is about 97.6%. Based on independent ground truth validation, it represents about 50 crop legend, which represents about 98% of all irrigated land statewide. That ground truthing is accomplished. We drive about 15,000 miles annually back and forth across the state in different areas, capturing a subset of the entire population of agriculture. We use that in our remotely sensed models to calibrate those models to basically create a fingerprint of what each crop type looks like, then dust to the rest of the crime scene, which is the areas that you didn't drive by, and predict what those crops would be. It's pretty necessary information for accurate land and water use estimation. And these are just some slides of the regional areas that we do for DWR, and just kind of gives you an idea of the extent of the mapping. I'm just going to roll through those fairly quickly. This is the DWR region here in Butte County, the northern region, which DWR represents for Butte County. And then North Central region, big boy of them all, the South Central region, a lot of mapping in that area. Of course, the Southern region, very different crop types down there. Okay, a lot of people ask us how do you assess your accuracy of the mapping, and I described that already. Our overall accuracy is about 97.6% based on individual crop types, and about 98.3% based on grouped crop types, which is a DWR request, and some of that data is here. I think in the next slide I'll provide a link, and I think this presentation will be uploaded for people's use, and you can go download the data. It's free, publicly available information for 2014, 2016. I hear that 2018 may be coming out fairly soon. I'd be very excited if DWR would release that. That'd be great. And then we've completed 2019 and 2020. For this study, we used the same type of DWR mapping for 1999 and 2004 that they did, basically drove by every field and logged it back in those years. So that allows us a historical time frame and a current time frame. So you can go download the data here, publicly available for your use and viewing. So with that as a foundation of the work that we did, we took all of our mapping from statewide land use mapping for Butte County and the Vina Subbasin, and performed the study that we did. And the results of the study are as follows. In Butte County, agricultural land use decreased by about 12,366 acres in those 20 years. 15,400 acres about came into production, and about 28,000 acres were removed from production. That's in Butte County. Okay, so then in the Vina Subbasin, which is the lighter blue line on the map on the right-hand side, agricultural land use decreased by about 2,800 acres. About 4,500 acres came into production, and about 7,200 or 7,300 acres were removed from production. So you can see in the map, this is the interesting way that we do this works. It's a spatial product, so it's a map. So on the map on the right-hand side, anything in red was mapped as irrigated agriculture in 1999, but isn't today. And anything in green wasn't mapped as irrigated agriculture in 1999, but is today. And this is just the agricultural footprint. It's interesting to note where reduction and increases occurred, basically on the fringes. A lot of the ground around the Sacramento River has converted from agriculture to environmental. Organizations and land trusts and Nature Conservancy and Audubon and others have acquired that land and created it and developed it into waterfowl habitat and wetland habitat, things like that, which also requires some water. So from an urban footprint, I remember we were able to map urban change as well. So in Butte County, we actually used an image from 1998 because there wasn't an image for 1999. So just a little shift there. But in Butte County, urban land use increased by about 3,600 acres over that 20-year time frame. And most, of course, that urban expansion occurred around the cities of Chico, Oroville, and to a lesser extent, Gridley. In the Vina subbasin, again, the light blue line, the net increase in urban land use was about 2,500 acres from about 17,000 acres to about 19,000 acres. So as we see a decrease in agricultural footprint, an increase in urban footprint, and an increase in environmental footprint. So when we do our spatial mapping, we look at a lot of imagery, and just to give you an idea of kind of visual idea of how that image that has changed over time, I think these are really fascinating image comparisons. The two images on the left-hand side are an example where rice was in production in 1999, but in present day, that rice land has been converted to an environmental use or a native category. The two images on the right-hand side are an example where agriculture did exist in 1999, where urban expansion has taken that agricultural land and converted it to urban uses. Forget all the numbers on the left-hand side unless you really want to get into the weeds. But again, I mentioned that crop acreage in Butte County has decreased over this 20-year study period that we looked at. Almonds have decreased by about 6,000 acres. Peaches have decreased by about 2,000 acres. Prunes have decreased by about 7,000 acres. Rice decreased too. There's been some conversion of rice ground to walnuts in some areas in Butte County. But that fluctuates from year to year depending upon the number of acres planted because it's an annual crop. Correspondingly, walnuts have increased by about 27,000 acres. But again, the overall trend is down. In the Vina subbasin, same trends occurred, just to smaller acreages. Almonds down by about 7,000, prunes by about 3,000, and rice down by about 5,000. But again, walnuts have gone up by about 13,000. So a conversion to majority of crops going down in conversion to walnuts. So what does this mean with regards to how much water is consumptively used, or how much water is evapotranspired in a year? And that's to be clear, there's the difference between applied water and consumed water. Applied water is that which is applied to the surface of the ground, and a majority of that is consumed and evapotranspired off into the atmosphere. But that's that consumptive use, or that water that the crop uses, is the outflow in the water balance. And so it's the component of the water balance that actually leaves the system. What's left over between the applied water and consumptively used water stays in the system. Much of it eventually returns back to groundwater. So to be clear, the difference between applied water and consumed water needs to be understood. The trend in this figure is basically that almonds, prunes, and rice, at least with the numbers that we used and validated with Alan Fulton from Cooperative Extension and worked with him on these numbers and a number of literature sources, shows a higher per unit area consumptive use than does walnuts. So again, if you have this shift from the almonds, prunes, rice, and other crops to walnuts, not only has the acreage decreased in those overall, but the use of water or consumed water that leaves the system has decreased because you're shifting to a crop with a lower water use. Why are walnuts a lower water use than, say, almonds? Well, if you remember, in almonds leaf out or essentially begin their evapotranspiration peak period about a month earlier than walnuts do. Generally speaking, walnuts have less trees per acre. Even though the leaves are bigger, there's less surface area for evapotranspiration to take place in the leaves, and there's actually more shade effect in walnuts that reduces the amount of surface evaporation from the soil. So what's the take-home message? If you have a reduction in irrigated acres and a shift to crops that use less water per acre, you're going to have a reduction in overall consumed water. And these are the values that we came up with in the study, and that study is available for publicly, I believe, through Butte County for folks to look at. In Butte County, over this 20-year time frame, I was surprised to see this, but when you start looking at the numbers, it makes sense. There's about a reduction of about 17% water, consumed water use over a 20-year time frame. And in the Vina subbasin, again, the smaller portion of Butte County is about a 9% reduction for mainly the two reasons that I talk about. Also, it's important to understand the increase in efficiency that growers have had over time in conversion from lower efficiency systems to higher efficiency systems in an attempt to potentially apply less water. Then you can get to applied water, which is the difference what I talked about before. The same trends hold true, and it's mainly driven by the change in acres of crops. Almonds have decreased in their applied water, walnuts have increased, rice has decreased in Butte County. And in the Vina subbasin, pasture has decreased, prunes have decreased, almonds have decreased, rice has decreased, and walnuts have increased. And again, it's driven mostly by that shift in the acreage in these crops to more walnuts from the other crops. One thing I wanted to bring forward is that agricultural land use is never static, and it's very difficult to project what's going to happen in the future. But with the implementation of Sigma, there's going to be some drastic changes in how things will look from a footprint of agriculture in the future. I'd encourage folks to take a look at the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. This is not for the Sacramento Valley, but it can impact the Sacramento Valley. And that water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley is an economic study that was developed for the purposes of trying to assess what things may look like economically in the future for agriculture in the whole Central Valley of California. In the San Joaquin Valley, it is expected that the impacts of Sigma will result in a reduction of about $7.2 billion in annual farm revenue loss. About 85,000 jobs will be lost statewide. About 2.1 billion in annual lost employee compensation will occur statewide. Up to 1 million acres in the South Valley will likely go fallow due to reduced ground and surface water supplies. 4 counties that will see the largest loss in employment and compensation, or as you might imagine, the South Valley counties. So that my point in presenting this slide is Sigma will have a significant impact on how things are looked at and how water is managed in California, specifically in the Central Valley. Butte County and therefore the Vina subbasin is in a good position. It's one of the few areas in the state that is actually seeing, kind of ironically, a reduction in irrigated acres and a pretty plentiful water supply. And so my point here is that agricultural land use is always changing. Market drives it, water supplies drive it, jobs drive it, and I expect that we'll see some fairly significant change moving forward. So thanks. Like you said, Paul, I'll wait for the end to answer questions, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so very much. And next up, we'll have Dr. Christina Buck from the department. Christina, if you can, there she goes.
Yeah, hi there. Okay, good afternoon. Let me get this on presentation mode. Okay, are you looking at the right thing or no? No, probably not.
Yes, but we are seeing, there we go. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so good afternoon. I get to be the third in this really great lineup. I'm Christina Buck, Assistant Director with Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this land use data that both Joel and Amy have talked about, how it's used and developed for use in a modeling tool called the Butte Basin Groundwater Model. And then we'll look at some of the outputs of that as well. So first I want to just stand back because now we've kind of moved into a new realm of integrated hydrologic models, which are really mathematical tools that represent the system using numbers and physics. And the system that we're talking about when we say integrated hydrologic models, we're talking about kind of all three systems that you think about when you think about water kind of either moving from the atmosphere as precipitation onto the ground surface, what happens to it there, and how it moves across the land surface, and then moves into the groundwater system. So integrated hydrologic models populate all three of those systems, the surface water system, the land system, and the groundwater system with the available data that we have, and then estimate components using equations and calculations. So the goal of any integrated hydrologic modeling really is important to recognize, right? We live in a very complex world. And so the real world is high definition, very clear, and our ability to simulate that is limited. And so our goal really is to have, although a fuzzy representation of the real world, we want a reasonable representation of the system that's good enough to answer our key questions. But having a good or great model, you know, that's fuzzy, but still representing the system well enough really does require high quality data. And so the pursuit is always to use the best available data sets within, of course, the resources we have to make them kind of fit the model. And I'll talk about that. So again, just another kind of cartoon of all the different processes that are happening, right? Precipitation, land, that comes down to the surface system, streams and rivers that flow across the landscape, diversions that are pulled off the rivers and streams for irrigation and water supply for urban or agricultural uses. And then how that interacts as, you know, water moves down into the groundwater system, either from the stream or just as recharge, wells that are pumping, right? So all of these different activities, many of which interact with each other or affect each other. And so integrated hydrologic models, one, require a lot of different types of data, right? It's really a great way to integrate lots of different types of information from, you know, precipitation data to soil characteristics to land use, crop types and urban footprint. And yet there's this distinction when we talk about models and model results between data input, and that's all of those different red components on the picture there, our information. We are looking to other sources to put that data together to put into the model. And then some components we maybe don't have data for. Those are things that are calculated by the model based on the data input and kind of the physics that drives all these interactions. And those are some of the blue components here on this picture. So of course, land use acreage is a major important piece that we need to tell the model, like what's going on at the land surface at every point of the area that we're interested in modeling. So why is land use important? Just started to touch on this. Of course, it affects water demand, both the amount of water that's used, but also the pattern of use, right? Whether it's an urban area that has a different kind of baseline indoor water use, which then has an outdoor water use pattern on top of that, or agricultural, right? Rice pattern of use for irrigating rice is different than orchards or row crops. So the land use drives both the amount and pattern of use. And it also affects how water is moving over or into the ground, right? So whether it's hitting concrete or pavement in an urban area, that's going to look different in terms of how much of it runs off versus moves into the ground or, you know, root zone and possibly groundwater system versus if it's on upland foothill areas or if it's near, you know, the floodplain. So all of those things kind of need to be captured. So we really need land use to be specified across the landscape, kind of in map view spatially, but also specified over time. And considering how often does it change, what, you know, time step is important to capture it. Fortunately, just for a layer of simplicity up here, we generally have stable crops, you know, permanent crops like orchards don't change within a year. You have a lot more multiple cropping of crops down in the San Joaquin and Tulare basins. So for us, a 1-year time step of capturing change in land use is really sufficient. Okay, so the Butte Basin groundwater model, which you may have heard about or maybe not, is the specific application of an integrated hydrologic model that we're using here to estimate water demands and water budgets and to understand groundwater for the development of our groundwater sustainability plans. And Joel mentioned the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and how that's changing kind of how we go about data and understanding and managing these systems. So we have these 3 subbasins in Butte County that we are interested in: the Vina subbasin, which is completely within Butte County, the Butte subbasin, which is mostly in Butte County, but also has portions of our neighboring Glenn and Colusa counties to the west, and a little tiny bit of Sutter there in the south. And then the Wyandotte Creek subbasin, which is also completely within the Butte County. So this, again, is an integrated hydrologic model. It's capturing what's going on in all 3 of those systems that I talked about. It's a number cruncher essentially over time and space, and it's pulling together lots of different types of data, and we'll look at that. And like I said, it's been kind of chosen tool to support the basin setting chapter and the water budget work of the groundwater sustainability plans. So a couple more stats on this tool. The historical data that's been developed for this model is for the water years 1971 to 2018, and it is a daily time step. So it's basically calculating everything on a daily basis, although some of the input data is monthly, for example, surface water diversions, and some of it's annual, like land use. So the land use is changing on an annual basis, but everything is calculated and kind of output as much as on a daily basis if you wanted to kind of spit it out that way. You can see that over here on the right, the grid that you see is covering the 3 subbasins and a bit beyond, both to the north and east and to the south. And you see all these little triangles. So these are called elements, model elements, but it's really kind of the accounting unit of the information is given to the model based on kind of that model area. And these vary in size from 15 to 670 acres. With an average of about 112 acres. You can see they're more dense and closer together and smaller in the Vina subbasin and generally in areas where groundwater pumping occurs. So in the Vina subbasin, here in the Butte subbasin, where groundwater levels vary more over space. And so to be able to capture that variability, we want smaller kind of accounting units in the model. And so that's why you see those patterns there. The boundaries just in the north, Deer Creek, so up into Hayman County. On the west side is the Sacramento River and mostly the county boundary. On the south, where it follows essentially the north side of the Sutter Buttes and the Yuba River, and then the eastern foothills to the east. So when we talk about the model area, this is what we're talking about. Okay, so now we'll dive into land use in the model. So essentially, we want data input for each year for each model element. So what we need is spatial data on an annual basis for each crop type. So I'll just dig into that a little bit. So crop types, these are the 26 different crop types that are represented in the models. The data that Amy and Joel talked about, there's kind of the crop types that are reported out, by the Ag Commissioner reports, crop types that are reported out by Land IQ data. Sometimes there's, a 1-to-1 relationship, and sometimes things aren't quite the same. And so you have to shuffle and shift to make consistent comparison between those data sources and the crop types that are represented in the model. But basically, each one of these crop types have an assigned acreage for every area in the model. So when we talk about area in the model, we're talking about these elements, again, these triangles, So acreage is specified for each crop type in each one of these elements. So if it's, this one here is pretty much 100% of that element is rice, which is what this color represents. But then you might have this element here, which is clearly a mix of, X amount acres of urban, X amount acres of deciduous orchard, or whatever it might be. And so each element has kind of a crop mix specified to that scale. So we clearly need mapped data, right? We need to be able to take a map of available land use data and kind of translate it into this model grid that we have. And so what's available out there for that? And this is what Joel talked about already. There's ground-based land use surveys by the Department of Water Resources, and these are available for Butte County for the single years of 94, 1999, 2004, 2011, 2014, and 2015, which is, is pretty useful in seeing trends and different maps, land use maps for each of those years. And then more recently, there's the satellite-based land use provided by the Department of DWR that Land IQ has developed, and that's available, as he said, for 2014 and 2016. So you can see the limitation here, though, from the modeling perspective, is that it's not available in every year. We could just specify it in these years and not have it change annually, and that's an approach that some modeling efforts would take or might take, but we would like to be able to capture kind of annual changes. So here's just a quick view before we move on to annual changes of the DWR surveys. It's just an example from the 2011 survey for Butte County, and where the different primary land uses are. It's high spatial detail. They also identify other useful information such as water source and in some cases irrigation method and some other useful attributes. Here's just a screenshot of the Land IQ spatial data from 2016. You can get this on Sigma Data Viewer, as well as all the download the data itself that Joel showed on that website. And again, this is high spatial detail and even kind of more clipped to actual irrigated footprint. As Joel described, one limitation here for us is that we need to specify every piece of the land, right? That's within the model area. So it's not, this hasn't it doesn't have a native or riparian category. And so we have to kind of fill that back in based on the leftover footprint and what we know from the DWR ground-based surveys. Okay, so that's the available mapped or spatial data that we have. And then we have some annual data sources. And this is what Amy was talking about, is the Ag Commissioner report data, and that's at the county level. So that data says we have X number of almonds in this year for Butte County. Well, I need it much more spatially specific than that, but we can still use the Ag Commissioner data because it's annual to adjust and capture the annual changes. There's also available water district level rice acreage, and that can also be used to adjust the other data. So this is what happens, and I should say that this work was done by Davis Engineering and primarily by Byron Clark and his team at Davis Engineering, first for the water inventory analysis report that we did in 2016, and then more recently for the update of the Butte Basin groundwater model as well. And so we essentially take the available mapped land use data and map it to the model grid, to these elements, and then use the Ag Commissioner report data to adjust and interpolate between years that have that spatial data so that we can capture those annual changes. And this approach inherently accounts for economic and other factors that are affecting annual cropping decisions. We can also use water district specific accounting. So Western Canal Water District and the Joint District Boards have rice acreage numbers that can be affected by fallowing based transfers. And so we can use that specific information for those areas to also capture what's going on with those programs. Okay, so then what we get is kind of the results. So when we say, the model results of land use, really it's data that's been developed and put into the model. It comes out of the model also, but it's really the sources are adapted versions of the Ag Commissioner data and the spatial data that's available. So this is a table that shows just for the entire model area, average acres by decade. And you can see similar trends in this table that have been highlighted by the other presentations as well. And we'll just zoom in a little bit. The focus recently, of course, because of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, has been looking at things through the lens of these subbasins, so Vina, Butte, and Wyandotte Creek. So I'll just flip through the land use of these subbasins. So Vina land use, this is a snapshot of the main categories of land use in the Vina subbasin. About 42% of the subbasin is native, so non-irrigated. About 45% is agriculture, and about 13% is developed or urban area, which also includes roads. And so you can see that kind of similar to the other presentations. So native is on top here, dark blue, and developed is the green. So irrigated ag has been relatively stable, over this period of 2000 to 2018. And this period, 2000 to 2018, was identified as the historical period in the basin setting chapters of the plans, recognizing that as you go back further in time, like I mentioned, the Butte Basin model actually goes back to 1971. And so it has land use data in it for the 70s, 80s, 90s, as that previous table showed. But the quality of that data and the spatial resolution of that data, right, it gets blurrier and blurrier as you go back in time. And so we have more confidence in the last couple of decades and our ability to really capture and characterize land use acreage than earlier decades. It gets blurrier as you go back further, but it's still valuable to have that historical data. So this is a snapshot of the maps of that. 2016 is the most current or available data that we had to work with. And as Joel mentioned, DWR just heard an update from them. They are hoping to release the 2018 in spring of this year. So we hope to see that. But this just gives you an idea of the snapshot of land use. You can see in the Vina subbasin a little bit of rice in this kind of aqua color down here in the south, where soils are heavier and conducive to rice, but mostly orchard dominated. And might be worth talking about this idle category for a minute. That can both be, idle is typically irrigated, but it's not planted or irrigated that year of the survey. And so it could be rice ground that for a number of reasons wasn't planted, or it could be an orchard that was pulled out and hasn't been replanted yet. So that would be considered an idle area as well. So Wyandotte Creek land use, similar, about 54% of Wyandotte Creek is native vegetation or rangeland, not irrigated, foothill area mostly. Agriculture is about 26% of that subbasin, and the developed area is about 20%. And again, you can see that the total irrigated acres has been relatively stable in the Wyandotte Creek as well, with some change. And that's where, the map that Joel showed of the reds and the greens of what is still there and what is new or isn't there is really helpful to add kind of the spatial component to these numbers. So here's just a map again of 2016. You can see Oroville area in the north, mostly orchards in the south along the Feather River is the boundary of this subbasin, and then a smattering of rice and orchards and some other crops as well. And then the Butte subbasin land use, finally, third subbasin is mostly rice, and then some orchards and other crops. Idle, you can see, jumps around a bit, and that's going to be largely driven in this subbasin by rice acreage. And then native here on the top and smaller amounts of developed, but still, a general relatively stable trend of irrigated agriculture. Okay, so I'll wrap up here with some implications for water demand. So the groundwater model essentially takes lots of different pieces of data, like I talked about, and uses that to estimate crop water demand. So it's using daily precipitation, also daily time series of evapotranspiration. So that's kind of the consumptive use driver that Joel was talking about, and that's specific to the crop, but it's daily input from, I believe, from the CIMIS station in Durham, or it's actually a little more complicated than that, how it's been developed, but it's attempting to also capture both kind of effects of weather and also things like increased orchard density planting. So we kind of upped the ET for almonds, say, over the last decade or two to capture some of those management changes. The model also has soil and land surface physical properties, which are driving crop water demand, right? If it's a really sandy soil, more of the applied water leaks out the bottom. So the soil properties, affect water use and water demand. And then land use management practices like irrigation methods, and that's kind of indirect based on the soil parameters. So the model uses essentially an irrigation scheduling approach. Okay, I'm gonna try to wrap up here so there's lots of time for questions. So this is model estimated and calculated applied water requirements for the different crop types. And you'll see that these numbers vary a bit from what's in the Land IQ report. But so it's important to kind of recognize these numbers are calculated from model results that are integrating all these different factors. And it's over the period of 2000 to 2014. So it's averaging the applied water for each crop divided by the average crop acreage for that time period. And so that's how we get this kind of acre foot per acre value. You can see the lowest water requirement crops here are miscellaneous deciduous, which could include things like peaches, vineyards, grain, and of course the heavier water intensive crops are rice and managed wetlands. Although it's important to note that some of that water runs off or becomes available for reuse on adjacent fields. Okay, so we can use this information to also try to answer this question of how does change in crop mix affect applied water, and this is the table that was included in the materials for this brown bag. And in the Vina subbasin, this approach, we're using this kind of consistent average applied water per crop to isolate the effects of land use change from variations in climate and soils and other things, right? So this is just looking at what effect does the changed crop mix have on applied water demands. And so from here, from 2000s to 2016, we also see a total reduction of applied water demand of about 13,000 acre feet. I think this amounts to about 6% reduction in the Vina subbasin for these time periods. So it's not apples to apples comparison with what Joel has, but similar trend. And then you can ask other questions like what other things are driving differences in applied water demand. So for instance, soil characteristics. So this is just looking at walnuts. I averaged the estimated applied water in these different subregions. So unorganized Tehama is up here in the north outside of Butte County. Vina, the original Vina area was this area. MNT is over here. Durham Dayton here. Esquan is down here. So in these different areas, does the applied water demand vary? And you can see that it does a little bit for walnuts. So soil properties and characteristics have a role to play, unsurprisingly, right, in water demand. So just a few closing thoughts. Integrated hydrologic modeling can help us explore the interconnection between these different complex and interrelated systems, the surface water system, the land surface system, the groundwater system. We can use models to explore how these different drivers are affecting applied water, right? Soil characteristics, water management, irrigation methods, wet and dry cycles, crop mix. Our focus today has been on the land use on the crop mix side of things, but you can see quickly that it's really a very integrated system that is driving applied water demand. So all the data and estimates, of course, are subject to uncertainty. You can see, hopefully in this presentation, how we basically take like the available data that we have and then massage it and adapt it and rework it as best we can to fit the needs of the modeling. And often there's not a one-to-one lineup between the data that you have and what you really need. But also good to recognize that trends and differences are more reliable than absolute numbers. So looking at the trends is always useful. So the results from this also suggest that the changed crop mix alone, isolating the change in crop mix, reduces applied water demand. And so then it leads you to begin to say, okay, what are the other factors that are driving increased applied water? And then you could start to look at climate or soils or other things. So with that, I will wrap it up.
All right. Thank you, Christina. So what we'd like to do now, since we're not all in the same room, we're in the same virtual room, is open it up to questions and answers. And I think for people who are on the phone, if you press *9, you can raise your hand and Autumn will be able to see that you've raised your hand, and then you can do *6 to mute and unmute. So if there are people who have questions and you are on Zoom, you can go down to the reactions little button thing at the bottom and raise your hand up. I think everyone's kind of getting very used to all this. So open it up. I see Supervisor Ritter's hands up.
Supervisor Ritter.
Hi there. Yeah. Thank you, all of you, for the presentation. It's very helpful. It's very useful. Christina, my question, I think is mostly for you. So you were saying it's not an apples to apples comparison, but when we're looking at applied water use, if I listen to your presentation and I listen to Joel's presentation, it seems like there's a really big disparity between the numbers. So you're saying there's this 2% change. And if I understood Joel's presentation correctly, he was saying it was 16 to 17% for the same basin-wide area. And so that's my first inquiry. I don't know if that's to Christina or if that's to Joel, but
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'll take it and then Joel can add in or correct me. I think, so the apples to apples that we have at this point is essentially the Vinessa Basin to the Vinessa Basin. What I didn't present any kind of Butte County specific. So what I heard Joel say, and this is where Joel, you can confirm or correct, that the Butte County change was about 17% reduction. And the Vinessa Basin was 7%. Is that right, Joel?
It was 9.
9. Okay, so 9. So 17 and 9. And what I said, I had the Vinessa Basin, where it's not totally apples to apples is our timeframes are not the same, but they're close, right? So with close timeframes, but slightly different, we saw from the Butte numbers, Butte model numbers, about 6% reduction. So it's pretty similar.
I apologize. I thought that you said 2.
Yeah, no,
2%.
that's okay.
Okay, and then
audio sometimes.
Okay, and then Joel, if I could ask you, when you gave your presentation, you gave, prior to the DWR slides, you had a slide that was the entire state of California. And I wasn't sure if that was showing crops or if it was showing water usage. And I'm wondering if I couldn't find a number on the screen, but it was before the slides that you had a series of DWR, and it was the last one before the DWR slides. And I'm just wondering if you have access to that, if you could tell me if what we were looking at was actually crops or if that was usage.
That was crops.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Joanne Parsley, feel free to ask your question.
Oh, yes. I think my question is probably for Joel, just to clarify things for me when I'm talking to friends. Would it be fair for me to say that from the farming perspective, Butte County land is built out?
That's a safe thing to say. Yeah, the footprint is built out pretty much to what can be irrigated or farmed profitably. And it's been that way for quite some time. The change within Butte County has been some urban movement into ag and some conversion to environmental. And then some areas like in south of Oroville, there's been kind of a wash between the two areas, but you don't see large areas within Butte County being developed into agriculture. And it just, you have the river on one side, the county boundary on the north, and south, and you have volcanic soils where you hit volcanic materials very quickly on the east. And so the soils just aren't suitable anywhere else. It's pretty much built out. True.
Thank you. I find that incredibly interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Colleen, feel free to ask your question.
Thanks, Autumn. Colleen Cecil, Butte County Farm Bureau. I wanted to ask a question to Amy and to Joel. In both of your opinions, what's going to be the best way for Butte County to create long-term groundwater sustainability? Is it farmers attempting to possibly bring in more surface water, specifically in the Vina area? Should we be looking at fallowing fields? What, in your opinion, is going to be the right approach for Butte County?
Hi, that's a great question. I actually think the solution is going to be in technology. I think that given the range of irrigation efficiencies that Joel presented in his report, that is a huge lever that our ag community has to make use of the available water that we already have and to be more efficient. And I would advocate that we spend effort on that rather than just say don't use or go get more. I think we can be more efficient. To what Christine was showing you is the demand of water given your soils is maybe have a conversation on whether that available water on growing walnuts in soils where they need twice the water, and maybe you have trade-offs for it. But I think we have the water we have, but I think we can make much better use of the water through technology. And that also begets other jobs. It creates a whole nother industry of things to bring in and to encourage, and programs we could get Chico State involved in, our community college involved in, and get kids solving and working on that problem.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I've been doing this work for about, well, technically my whole life. I changed sprinkler pipe in Butte County for 13 summers and never got paid, but that's a different story altogether. I've learned over time that it's important, just like with anything, to be careful about how efficient you ask somebody to be. For every action, there's another reaction. And one of the reasons, it's kind of a strange thing to say, right? In one of the reasons why we've had such declines in groundwater, especially in the South Valley, is because we've asked agriculture to be very, very efficient, thereby less return flows from agriculture have recharged groundwater. Now, we want agriculture to be efficient, so water can be used in different places, I agree. But I think we need to be careful about what we say when we talk about increased efficiencies and such. I think it's Colleen, to answer your question, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think if Butte County wants to be sustainable, they need to look at all avenues and to optimize all avenues, to prioritize all avenues. I don't think it's a one solution issue. I can tell you from my experience in working with a number of the GSAs in the South Valley, if you think you have it bad in Butte County, you don't. They're facing ominous conditions down there, and it affects everyone, not just agriculture. And I think that's why I put that last slide in there to kind of give you a taste of what's to come when all that ground gets fallowed. And think about, just like if 1 million acres gets fallowed in the South Valley and then it's dry, what's air quality going to look like? So there's always these reactions to action. But for Butte County, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. And it's important to recognize all your options and evaluate them objectively, and to look at which ones are the best solutions to maintain sustainability in the economy of Butte County.
people
Well,
for answering the
and I guess
question.
if I can add to that is also let's be clear about not laying it on the backs of the farmers and growers there, that this is about where our community is and how we live. And so to be creative in those solution sets. So because the ag economy is very important to Butte County, and we need to champion that and not, I guess I want to be, make sure we don't put the problem on the farmer because they're the consumer of the water. It's like, how do we be helpful to that and make them successful?
Thank you.
Supervisor Lucero, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering about the study, you know, irregardless of apples to apples and all of that, we know that groundwater is in a reduced state. So I'm wondering, how do we do this work without taking into consideration other draws on the aquifer, like from Tehama and Glen, as presented in Amy's presentation in the beginning, when you look clearly at what is happening. And I know there are some limitations because I've met with Christina on the model, because our model stops on the western boundary of the Sacramento River. So it doesn't take into consideration anything that's going onto the other side of the river or under the river or any of those boundaries. How do we deal with that? I'm not sure who that's to.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it, and then maybe Paul can add. I think, like you said, we have some limitations with the Butte Basin model, so we're going to need to work with our neighbors and the modeling tools that they're using, and recognizing that this is a long-term planning, planning program and process. So I would just say, I think we need to understand, our best our best ability to characterize our water budget. I think someone just shared their screen. Yep, there we go. To understand our water budget and then and compare notes with our neighbors, and that's a long-term coordination that is definitely needed. But recognizing that water is both flowing into our subbasin and out of it, so having kind of a two-way street mentality is going to be important as well.
And then just as a follow-up, I'm curious about what Joel thinks about the latest DWR maps that came out that are showing wells considerably down on the west side, kind of as a cone going toward Chico. I'm sure you're aware of those latest maps that they just released.
I think I'm aware of what you're talking about. Different places have different conditions, and I think Amy said it correctly. Things are different in different places. Butte County, as Joanne asked the question, is essentially built out, and actually the footprint of agriculture is slightly decreasing for the reasons that I mentioned. But in other areas, it's increasing, and what comes with that is an increasing need for water. And so I'm an objective scientist, and that's the way I operate in those areas. And we see it in the South Valley. I see it in the South Valley all the time. And it's the reason why Sigma came about, and for many reasons, and that's important to know. So it's not the same everywhere.
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you, Nadine. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you please raise your hand.
I don't know how to do that. I don't have enough buttons. I don't know if it's because I don't on my thing, I don't see the thing for raising hands.
Nadine, why don't you ask a question then?
Okay, so I heard all of the presentation, and nobody mentioned the proposed Butte County Water District. And have you taken a public opinion about the new water district?
One, I don't think there's any proposal that's been, right, Nadine, you're sharing your screen, I believe. There we go. That's out there, and we wanted to keep the questions on the land use changes and analysis from the three presenters. But I think if that proposal comes up, there'll be other forums and other places to talk about that.
Rob Berry, would you like to ask your question?
Did you say Eric?
I called on Rob Berry.
Sorry, I heard Eric too. Yeah, this is Rob Berry. I just have a couple of sort of questions from a layperson standpoint. Number one is, I'm curious if you can give a general condition of the Butte County subbasin. Is it sort of in the yellow zone, red zone, or green zone in terms of its current status? And the second thing I'm wondering is, I've heard conversations about working with the Paradise Irrigation District for some pipelines that would provide some temporary water from the Paradise resources, but also would make available certain water right allocations out of the Orville Dam. And I wonder if you could just give a quick status of that discussion.
Yeah, I'll cover those. And I think in a layperson's call, where the basins are at, I think generally they're in sort of a yellow zone. I think, as it's been mentioned, San Joaquin Valley, critically overdrafted basins, clearly in the red zone, and a lot of work, and they probably don't have the means to support what land uses they have in agriculture. We do have some issues to have the subbasins work within their sustainable yield and ride out with what land use and what future growth projections are, but not insurmountable in comparison to other areas. In terms of the PID intertie project that was talked about a few years ago, that there's no project right now going forward. And so right now the Paradise Irrigation District is participating in an option study that's being funded by the state to look at long-term sustainability for water supply along the ridge and PID. And I believe that study is going to be started in the next month or so, and they're going to look at a range of things for PID, and that may include that. So we're going to have to wait and see the outcome of that, and it would be a PID study.
Daniel, feel free to ask your question.
You're still muted, Joan. There it is. You got it.
Sorry. Hi, Joan Webster here. Thank you for your presentations. I was just wondering, and this is probably a question for Amy, for reading some stuff I've researched and stuff, the consultants for the Vina GSA planning process, they consider the Tuscan aquifer almost balanced. I mean, maybe it's a little bit short of water, but how much do you kind of agree with that? As far as, do you think it's close to being balanced, and then what do you think the biggest threat to the Tuscan aquifer is?
Great questions. I think where I see the data is that we are about balanced, and that we're probably a little bit overdrawn now, but that so I think going forward, we're very close to balance. So I really don't think it's going to take too terribly much effort to get ourselves back in alignment and stop the decline on the ground that we're seeing on the wells. I think it's more an awareness going forward. So kind of I agree with what Paul's assessment is, that we're we're at yellow. I think what Sigma got us early enough so that we kind of, you know, we're aware of what's going on, and we can steer the car a little differently. So I don't think we're too terribly far off. I'm more worried actually about San Joaquin Valley is highly motivated to come and do whatever water dealy sorts of things they can do or legislate or something. That my worry is that they're going to, that rules will change and they will take water from us.
Thank
for
you.
some form or fashion. And we just have enough right now.
Thanks.
Ben King, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, first of all, thank you. It was an excellent presentation, very informative. Thank you for all your work. So my question really regards prioritization, and I haven't seen how this has been handled yet, but my understanding is that AB 685 made a human right for fresh water. And since we have domestic water users and municipalities on groundwater here, and we're dealing with Sigmas forever, how are you incorporating that prioritization? It's almost, to me, it seems like a super prioritization where if you don't have good drinking water, you're kind of out of the game in the modeling and then as you develop this plan. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take that. And so that's going to be one of the things, policy call that will be reflected probably in the plans, the human right to water, which is a state policy. And it's really going to be driving some of the undesirable results we're looking at, principally the highest risk of shallow domestic wells. So that will be our primary focus for protection. And when we're going to start deeming that things have gone awry is if we start having dewatering of domestic wells. Similarly, we have to also take into consideration, you know, municipal and other water purveyors for drinking water, as well as ag. So it's going to be balancing all that, but principally, again, because we're in sort of a need to do some work, but it's not insurmountable. We can get there. It's a matter of lifting all boats, but really looking out for the most vulnerable, the highest risk of impact, and that'd be shallow domestic wells and groundwater dependent ecosystems along the riparian corridor and other locations.
Kathy, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, hi, thank you. My question goes back to something that Amy just said, and the first presentation had such a large relationship to the whole state. And the second two seem to be more focused on the county data. So, but it's like, I don't see how you can separate. I mean, it's like that, I understand that we know up here that there's some limitations in regards to our physical land borders and our underground no borders, that's difficult, and we have to work with our neighbors and whatever their data is or the data we have about them. But the relationship of water going south doesn't seem to be in the second two presentations. It's like, I don't see how you can keep it so isolated and not bring in that information of the amount of water being used there, but also the amount of water being sent there. And I'm just wondering if DWR, as is all of our, view, are also taking that into consideration, because it seems pretty important.
Yeah, I'll answer that. And one of the focuses we have why the data and information was locally, because that's what we need to make our decisions on managing. And Amy also had good information, Sac Valley and Butte County. In terms of water going south, I think as Joel pointed out, there isn't a drive for increased water going south. I mean, that interest in transfers and others has been around for a long time. Not many, I haven't seen any of the plans that are talking about relying on increasing water. And actually, since 2009, there's been statutes changes that reduce the reliance on water going through the Delta and requiring people to live within their means within the region. So, but it's something we're keeping a close eye on, and maybe this could be a topic for another brown bag seminar. That's very complicated and very timely topic.
And can I just add, because that comment and a couple others have, pointed out kind of always the threat of the South wanting the North's water. And I think it's important to note that that has been a unifying motivator here for a really long time, and really motivated the investment in the quality of information that we have on water and on land use. Because the model that I talked about was really a grassroots effort to quantify our water resources here, and invested in by a variety of agricultural, urban, environmental groups and agencies for the protection of water resources for the North State. So that's in our blood here, and it will continue, and our investment in this information supports that. Priscilla, I see you. I know, Autumn, you're calling questions.
And I don't have a hand, more of a comment than anything. I see Mark Kimmel, she was listening in too, maybe. It was the threat of the wanting to put the big straw down into the Tuscan Aquifer that got us started with the first effort that we spent about 3 years on, if my memory is correct. And so it's in the late 90s, and got us started by, and also I've had a lot of time with land use, and I'm also a political scientist. And the concept that I'm very encouraged by with all of this is integrated management of the resource. And I applaud the presentations today, and thank you for excellent presentations. And I'll be looking from the perspective of an 85-year-old who's been in land use and water just about all of my public service life. Thank you. Not as an expert, but as a layperson.
Eric, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Joel, in your presentation, you separated ET, applied water into ET, and water going back into the groundwater system. And Christina's used an example that sandier soils would have higher applied water, but that would put more water down into the groundwater system. Should GSAs focus more on ET of crops than the applied water that they seem to be going down the road with?
Well, they're absolutely connected, and I don't, as I said in my presentation, the out component of the water balance is ET. That's the consumptive use, that's the out. So monitoring that is really important, but it's also important to monitor or understand the applied water too, to be able to work with growers to help them perhaps achieve the same consumed water with a lower applied water, if that makes sense, which can be done. It's just a function of water management. So both pieces are important to understand, and they both are critical to understanding how to best manage the water resource that's there. But you have to know both.
Mr. or Mrs. Hieronymus, it's your turn.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate the data-driven presentations. I'm a disaster relief advocate here in Butte County, and I grew up in Oroville, and the lake's at 38% in Oroville. I understand Butte County is not as bad off as the rest of the counties as far as drought's concerned, but we do have a large fire survivor population. We have a lot of burn scar area to cover, plant fruit trees, and looking at the crops, hearing about the data, I have two questions. With the farmers, what are we doing with gray water systems? Is that implemented? Is it regulated? Are we collecting data? If so, how much of this water is being evaporated by watering during the day? Are there any regulations? Are there any recommendations? Thirdly, where is the water from Lake Oroville going? How are we looking ecologically about almonds going up 42%? Are we bringing in bees? How are we feeding the bees? How are we looking at the eco restoration of this area? I have so many questions regarding water. So I really appreciate these brown bag lunches because I'm learning a lot historically. And I love that there's scientific data, but I feel like somebody mentioned technology going forward. We have a large percentage to get to our climate action plan. We have a huge jump we need to make. So what are the technologies and what are innovative ways for Butte County to make that leap from where we've come to where we need to be? Thank you.
Great questions. And I'll start off on Lake Oroville. Lake Oroville is a state water project. There's 29 state water project contractors. Butte County is one of them. There are 5 north of the Delta. So it's a water supply reservoir for the people who have contracts. All the other questions you have, which are very good and they're topical about the groundwater sustainability plans that are under development. So I'd suggest if you're not on the mailing list for getting updates on sustainable groundwater management and our newsletter, because we try to put information out that is in better readable form on updates and different topics, do that. But I think all those things you talked about on policies, on gray water and other things are going to be part of the conversation about how we better sustain and manage our water for future generations. So I know we're well over 1:30. I'm going to have Ryan wrap this up because we want to keep it at least not too long for people who want to view it later if you want to go back to view it. So Ryan?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. This is Ryan Shore. My question was to Joel. Thank you for joining us today, Joel. I always appreciate your insights and have for years. I wanted to know if you have done any work in respect to soil types as it relates to recharge, specifically as we start talking about Sigma and so forth. Just driving around today, you see in the rain, fields that are holding water and fields that aren't. And I think that dynamic is one that may need a little further exploration, but maybe you are working on that already. So could you just touch on that briefly for us? And thank you again.
Sure. Any recharge basin you want to cite is the most better operative in a coarser textured soil that will allow greater infiltration and recharge your groundwater. All soils perk, just some like where you are, Ryan, perk very, very slowly. And so there's a layer that was a spatial layer that was developed by UC Davis called the SAGD Index, Soil Assessment Groundwater Infiltration System, or I forget the actual description of the acronym, but it looks at all the soils, the upper 6 feet of the soils based on soil surveys from the standpoint of determining what areas are better than others for recharge. And we've done some additions to that and worked with the Almond Board of California for that purpose, and they're considering recharge. It's definitely one of the tools that can be used. The comment about gray water is there's a lot of reuse that goes on in the state of California, but not so much in Butte County, and that's an opportunity as well. There's lots of opportunities. We're again, I'll just kind of stop by saying, relative to other areas, we're in an opportune position. We just need to be smart about how we take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, and also, I guess I'd like to chime in. There's a program called Floodmar, which is doing surface recharge when the rivers are running high and overflowing. I think one of my other learnings out of that was that we need to slow the flow of the water, into the rivers, and it could be some low-tech technologies of just getting, not getting your water into the gutter, but to have your gutters, flood your lawn and recharge in your lawn, in your lawn areas. Maybe could be done remotely, but there's recharge and local recharge and small scale recharge with the Floodmar project. I think would be very, very interesting. It goes to where, put the water where it perks and get it to where it can get down into the aquifers.
And I would just add briefly that I think the Butte Basin groundwater model, having soil parameters and applied water and all of these different kind of interactions is a tool that can be used along with those other data sets that Joel mentioned. Kind of multiple lines of evidence are always good, but it's one of them that we can use to explore some of those questions. And the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is really forcing us to think in a much more integrated way about these systems, which gets to your question that integrated a lot of different things. And I think we're being challenged to do that more and better, which is a good thing for all of us. So thank you all for today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I want to thank Amy and Joel and Christina for excellent presentations, and you all for joining us here today and asking excellent questions. So really looking forward to the next brown bag seminar. I think this worked out pretty well, and there's a slew of topics that people even raised today that I think would make great topics for brown bag seminar. So without that, I wish you all a great rest of the day, and take care, and I'll see you soon.